By Argentina's National Day, May the 25th, 6 British ships had been lost, among them the sister ship of the Sheffield, HMS Coventry.
The deck was so steep you could hardly walk on it, and in that, men were finding their way around compartments that were completely full of smoke and fire. They would find a compartment which was free, and we made a great attempt to try and save the ship. But then it was quite clear she was going over, and so we very regrettably had to abandon her.
News reached her home port next day. A score of men had died with the ship. They'd been on picket duty, protecting the support vessels which were landing supplies at the San Carlos bridgehead. Messages of sympathy were received by the Navy at Portsmouth from all over the world. There was grief too at the loss of the Cunard cargo ship Atlantic Conveyor. 11 crewmen died and her captain Ian North. The 15,000-ton vessel had been carrying supplies which were desperately wanted for the push towards Port Stanley. She was destroyed by an Exocet missile. At home, there was anger as well as grief.
John Locke was on TV at 10:15 last night, and it was announced that another ship had been hit. It was severely hit, as far as we knew. That was all the information he gave us. I mean, it could have been the Hermes, it could have been Invincible, it could be any one of them. All we want is just to be told there and then.
The Gosport MP, Mr. Peter Viggers, faced the wives, and as a representative of Her Majesty's government, he bore the brunt of their bitterness. They wanted to know what was happening to their men. They didn't want half the story. Most particularly, they didn't want to be told that one of our ships had been hit, but not which one.
Well, it was on the 9 o'clock news, wasn't it? You could have given a list of ships that had been hit, telling us that all the next of kin had been informed. But I must admit, I think you've handled this cruelly. I really do.
Names and addresses of dependents were held at the headquarters of the Navy's Welfare Service in HMS Nelson at Portsmouth, and it was from there that the good news and the bad came to the families. There was contention too between the next of kin of men who died and the military authorities, a sad and sorry argument over what arrangements should be made for their burial. The Ministry of Defence insisted that it was traditional that servicemen be buried where they fell. Many families pleaded that they should be brought home. The issue caused grief and anguish to families already stricken by bereavement. The mother of Stephen Pryor appealed to her MP for help. Stephen was one of the paras who died in the assault on Darwin and Goose Green. His home was in Brighton. His mother said she knew Stephen would have wanted to be buried at home, not in a war grave 8,000 miles away.
You know, it's such an unfriendly, cold, hostile place, you know. And we would like somewhere where we could go and visit, you know, put a few flowers and pay our respects. It doesn't seem the same. It's such a long way away.
The government finally conceded. They agreed that the dead would be brought home if that was what their families wanted. Most, though, were buried at sea. The business of keeping the troops informed and their spirits up continued. Navy news rolled off the presses in Portsmouth, the Royal Navy's own newspaper, with a message for the men that they weren't forgotten by those at home. And at Aldershot, the Army's fortnightly magazine Soldier was being put together. Copies were flown out to every man in the task force. The edition included a special feature on the sailing of the QE2. Task Force wives, meanwhile, had the occasional outing to take their minds off their worries. 100 of them were given a trip to the London musical The Sound of Music. It was organised jointly by the bus company, the theatre and the Portsmouth Naval Chaplain's Office. For some of the Task Force children, an invitation to a birthday party. Marwell Zoological Park near Winchester asked the children of men in 3 para if they'd like to help celebrate the zoo's 10th anniversary. Wives of the merchant seamen who'd gone to war were getting together for the first time. Cunard, with 4 ships requisitioned, organised a series of meetings starting in Southampton. It was 3 weeks since the QE2 had sailed, and the wives and mothers of her crew found comfort in sharing their worries.
I've come along to meet the other wives that are in the same situations and, you know, see if we can find a bit of news out about the ship and the men.
I could learn something, as up till now I haven't had a letter from the boys. I've got twin sons on the ship, they're 18. I just haven't had any mail whatsoever. And it might be just something to help me, peace of mind, because I've just been going scats for 3 weeks.
Cunard management told the women what they could. It wasn't much, but the gesture was appreciated.
Who's in favour of doing this again in 2 weeks' time? Same time, come on.
Yes, we all are.
Very good, okay. Thank you very much.
4 days later, an RAF team who'd survived the attack on Cunard's Atlantic conveyor were home. All 16 members of 18 Squadron Detachment from Odium in Hampshire travelled the last leg of the journey by Chinook. The families broke ranks for a reunion on the runway. Since the missile attack nearly 3 weeks earlier, the men had travelled by sea to Ascension Island and then by RAF VC-10 to England. They brought with them indelible memories of the day they'd come close to death and of the merchant seamen who'd been lost with their ship.
Turn around and look.
You're making this difficult for Daddy. Give us a kiss, Sue. Come on, give us a kiss.
Well, the first I knew there was a loud bang, and I turned round and saw a fireball coming towards me, and I was knocked over by the blast. As I got up, I couldn't see any more flames. The fireball had gone, so it hadn't reached me, fortunately.
I was on the bridge at the time and actually saw the missile come in.
You saw the missile coming at the ship?
Yes, I suppose I saw it about 1 second before it actually impacted.
Travelling very low down.
Very low and very fast.
What did it look like?
Just a red blob coming towards us, quite noisily, in fact.
And can you remember what your thoughts were in that instant?
I'd rather not repeat them, actually.
Welcome home parties were breaking out all over the south. The men who'd survived the attack on the Sheffield were coming back. They were the heroes of a 4.5-hour fight against the fire, which destroyed their ship after she was hit by an Exocet missile. The Royal Military Police at Chichester prepared their keep for the reception of the only Argentine prisoner to be brought to the United Kingdom. International lawyers in France and Sweden had an interest in Captain Alfredo Astiz. He'd taken brief command on South Georgia after the invasion. He'd surrendered to the British after a 3-hour battle. Astiz was held at Chichester in accommodation befitting an officer for only 5 days, while investigations went on into whether he could be required to answer allegations of murder and torture. Then, in one of the most discreet moves of the campaign, he was sent home again. The British government had decided that observing the terms of the Geneva Convention took precedence over the wishes of the French and Swedish governments to interview Astiz over the fate of 3 of their nationals. Astiz had been approached by the head of Sussex CID, but he declined to answer any questions. Alfredo Astiz, also known as the Blonde Angel, was airlifted to Gatwick and put on a plane to Brazil. In Portsmouth, the Navy was getting up to date with its paperwork. The official inquiry began into the loss of HMS Sheffield. And in the English Channel, the QE2 was heading for home after 4 weeks and 2 days as a troopship. She was greeted as a seasoned campaigner and a much-loved friend. The Royal Yacht Britannia paid her compliments to the QE2 as she passed into the Solent, and from on board, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother saluted ship and men. She'd sent a personal message to the liner, expressing her pride in and admiration for what the men on board had been through and what they'd achieved.
I'm meeting my mother from the QE2.
From the QE2?
Yes.
So go to the bottom of the road, 38 and 39, berth on your right-hand side.
The police did their best to allow in only relatives of those on board, and there were 4,000 of them, waving the merchant and Royal Navy seamen home. June Hewitt with twin sons on board, and the daughter and grandchildren of stewardess Lorna LaPerth. The dockies tied her alongside, and the hunt was on for one face in a crowd. First off, the 700 Cunard crew. They'd logged 14,000 miles to war and back. Then the servicemen, bearing the marks of battle.
I think I must go home, really.
Captain David Hart Dyke of the lost HMS Coventry. The fate of two Royal Fleet auxiliary vessels which had sailed from Marchwood just across Southampton Water had been tragic too. They'd taken supplies and men to the Falklands, and they'd been hit by Argentine fighter bombers as they unloaded at Bluff Cove. 57 men had died, and the Sir Galahad lost. The men who died had been taken to the South Atlantic by the QE2. They were almost all Welsh Guards. 3 days after the QE2's return, the news that Portsmouth and the whole country had been longing for.
After successful attacks last night, General Moore decided to press forward. The Argentinians retreated. Our forces reached the outskirts of Port Stanley. Large numbers of Argentine soldiers threw down their weapons. They are reported to be flying white flags over Port Stanley.
There was enormous relief that the fighting had stopped and that the men of the task force had won a famous victory.
Nearly 15,000 Argentine troops were taken prisoner.
And there was the deepest sympathy for those whose men wouldn't be coming home.
Mrs. Thatcher told MPs that about 250 British servicemen and civilians have lost their lives. John Humphreys will be here at 9 o'clock with the news and Falklands special introduced by David Dimbleby. But that's all for me, and on this day of better news, I wish you a good evening.
Thank you, Richard.
The alarm went off 9 o'clock this morning and the radio came on and it was the news, and I just literally woke up to the Argentines have surrendered. And I was out of bed, I was dancing around the flat, I was singing, and our neighbour, she came and knocked on my door, she said, "You all right?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "I thought you'd finally gone mad." I said, "No, I just said, I'm so happy."
Oh, it's fabulous. It's just absolutely fabulous, and I've felt fabulous all day.
It's terrific.
I had a few tears this morning going out the door. I stopped myself, sort of going up the road, like I felt a bit of a fool. But the tears were there. I mean, if anybody spoke to me, I think I would have burst a flood of tears.
Oh, I didn't. I on the day they sailed, I had nothing but tears in my eyes, and everybody I looked at, I wanted to flood up. But today I went to work riding my bike, and I think I was grinning at everybody. I think they must have thought I was lunatic. You know, I mean, I didn't. I felt exactly the opposite. It's just what I've been needed. Yeah. Just the tonic that I've needed over all these weeks of tragedy, of men's lives. But now I can say, with all honesty, those men, those poor men that have died, haven't died for nothing.
No. Next home, the luckiest ship in the task force, HMS Glasgow, slow and listing. She'd been hit by an Argentine bomb. It passed clean through her hull and out the other side without exploding. The men of the parachute regiment were ferried home in 5 VC-10s. They'd been in the thick of the Falklands fighting, and they'd lost 40 men. Prince Charles, their colonel-in-chief, said he was proud of them.
Very much so, yeah. I find it a great privilege anyway to be the colonel-in-chief of this regiment. And they've proved it completely, I think. They're astonishing people.
Thanks for coming.
There's this great thing of having regimental spirit and pride. You can't beat it. Never let there be numbers of regiments. You've got to have proper tradition.
The Paras had won at Goose Green, and they'd gone on to take Port Stanley. For 10 weeks, wives and girlfriends had hung on to every word to come out of the Falklands for news of their men.
Come on.
pistol, is it? Embarrassing. Too much embarrassment.
The Paras had lost their commanding officer and his adjutant in a death or glory assault on an enemy gun post. When Colonel H fell, his place was taken immediately by Major Chris Keeble.
We didn't know we were outnumbered. I thought, Colonel H thought, that we were about parity. But at the end of the day, at the end of that first day, we had run out of ammunition. I discovered that there were 112 civilians inside the settlement. I hadn't been able to use my artillery on the settlement because we had come to save the place, not destroy it. And I had a lot of casualties on the battlefield. And so my problem was, how do I capture the place and solve all these other problems?
And so, what did you do?
Well, it seemed to me the only thing to do was to offer an ultimatum to the military commander. And so I got a couple of Argentinian prisoners of war. We made a couple of white flags, and I wrote out in Spanish on a piece of paper an ultimatum which said, basically, you either surrender or we'll destroy you. But whatever you do, you must release those civilians. And I then sent these two jokers down in the morning, and I said, if you return, I'll understand you wish to talk. If you don't return, I understand you wish to fight.
So the Battle of Goose Green was won by Britain, and that was the decisive battle of the whole Falklands conflict.
I think it was a turning point, both for us. Our fortunes improved from then onwards. And I think it was a turning point on their side. They realized then that they were going to lose this war.
On a hazy morning in July, Canberra made a memorable reappearance, ghost-like in the grey Southampton water. Her sister ship, the ferry Dragon, saluted her. So did the smallest of craft. The ship they dubbed the Great White Whale of Falkland Sound shimmered into sight, a great white lady. The Scarlet helicopter, which had brought Prince Charles to join the Canberra as she came down the Solent, lifted him away again. The Prince had said he wanted the men and women on board to enjoy their homecoming without the constraints of a royal presence. 30,000 were waiting. They perched on cranes and packed the quay. The welcome was ecstatic. The men of 4-5 Commando couldn't wait to get ashore. There was a snoot to be cocked at the QE2 and a joyous hornpipe to be danced. The celebration cut clean across rank, and there was a special welcome for the women who'd been among Canberra's 415 volunteer crew. P&O, Pacific and Orient, had conquered a fresh and unfriendly ocean. Their flagship, battered and stained and flushed with victory, was back from the battle line.
We couldn't have done without it, definitely. She was the ship for us at the task force. Great.
What do you remember above all else of the conflict itself?
106 to meet Mrs.
I was frightened.
Then suddenly they were all coming home. The ferry Europic, smudged with hasty camouflage. She'd never been further before than Le Havre. Her men had spent 2 days at anchor in the most dangerous stretch of water in the South Atlantic, Falklands Sound, also known as Bomb Alley. The assault ships, fearless and intrepid back from the front, their landing craft had led them out more than 3 months earlier. They led them home again. The welcome ahead was overwhelming. There was the Antrim, who'd survived a direct hit from a 1,000-pound bomb. The landing ship Sir Geraint from Marchwood. And the Stromness, flagship of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The ambulance ship Herald, in peacetime one of the Navy's hydrographic vessels. She'd worked with the hospital ships Uganda, Hecla and Hydra in what they called the Red Cross box. 50 of her company were trained in basic medical techniques. They didn't include hanging onto your cap in a stiff Solent breeze. The ambulance ship lived up to her name. She heralded the return of the task force flagship Hermes.
We have a very special place in our hearts for the largest of them all, the Hermes.
Well, I think she done very well for an old ship.
Very good, anyhow. I think she done very, very well out there, anyhow. I think all of them done very, very well out there. I'm only sorry to see that some of the ships never come back.
She flew the flag proudly. You know, what can you ask of her? She's an old girl.
Yeah.
She's done very well.
Hermes had completed 108 days sea service and steamed 35,000 miles since she led the first of the task force from Portsmouth on April the 5th. A send-off then had been recorded in the ship's log. Large crowds waved ship off. It's not been disclosed how the ship's log recorded her welcome home.
There's 75 pence, look. The flags are 30 pence.
I didn't know that.
What do you think of that, fellas, eh?
About all the sailors, marines, pilots and the doctors and nurses who are on board ships sailing towards the Falkland Islands, especially the daddies of some of our children in our school. We ask you to keep them all safe. We also ask you to guard and help the leaders of our country and Argentina so that their meetings will be successful.
Fabulous. It's just absolutely fabulous.
He said he might get his medal after all, or get a bullet.
It's not only the lives of the 1,800 Falkland Islanders at stake. The whole world has put their eyes on this situation.
Anybody who joins the armed services realizes that they will at one time perhaps be called upon to be a pawn in a political game.
I thought, oh, bombs, just guns, so they can't get too damaged. And I saw a missile, and it literally went into the centre of the ship and just blew the whole lot up, and that scared me. I thought if one of those hit his ship, he wouldn't stand a chance. And that is what scares me when you get to an orthodox.
Is my husband safe and well, and I keep telling him letters for Christ's sake, look after yourself, take care.
I was really overjoyed that Steve was coming home, but then after a few minutes I did stop and think about the poor wives who haven't got their husbands coming home, and I think this is when they're really going to feel it, and I did stop and think, and I had a few thoughts for them.
Everybody sort of was thinking about the people that didn't come back and are not going to come back.
My husband, when he's written, he said that how upset that they all are at this tragic waste of lives, and he hopes that they haven't died in vain. So I think all the men, although they'd be relieved to come home to their wives, will never ever forget the men that have died to save an island.